A stately gentleman dressed in a military jacket and pressed trousers carefully settled into his chair at the Moscow theater. It was 1936. An attendant collected his overcoat, his fur hat, and then asked for his gloves. It was a bitterly cold January night in Moscow, and the gentleman was reluctant to give them up. His military medals jingled together as he bent forward to tighten a shoelace. The medals sounded intimidating. They sounded proud. He sat up a little bit straighter and smoothed the corners of his steel-gray mustache. He smoothed his hair back. Each strand was like a Russian citizen. It needed to be accounted for. It needed to act exactly like the rest. And it needed to behave just how he wished it to. As he looked down at the assembling audience from his private box, he started feeling that he wouldn't enjoy this performance of Shostakovich's latest success, Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district. After all, the opera had debuted 2 years ago and had achieved success with both the Soviet populace and opera-goers around the world. It had even become a beloved staple in the American city of New York. If the Western fools in New York liked it, he knew it was unhealthy for the people of the Soviet Union. But he would suffer through the opera anyhow. He watched with interest as the actors carried out the plot. He didn't give his thoughts away to those around him, except for a few dark shimmers in his eye. He even clapped politely between acts. At some point in the fourth act, his patience broke. The audience was laughing. They were crying. They were genuinely moved. He thought they looked pathetic. It was not how a well-run Soviet citizenry should look. He abruptly stood up and left. Few people noticed when the man with the military jacket left, but a certain friend of Shostakovich had been watching. Startled, he leaned over to Shostakovich and whispered in the composer's ear, "Stalin's gone. He just got up and left." Shostakovich's face paled. The audience began to applaud and demand a curtain call, oblivious to what lay ahead. But deep in his musical soul, Shostakovich knew something had gone terribly wrong. This is Backstage Podcast. Hello, and welcome to this week's Backstage Podcast, where we tell you true stories about music and its musicians. My name is Justin Blackstone, and I will be your guide today as we traverse the mountain of narrative that my co-host Adam Gingrey has prepared for us. I hope you're ready to join us as we take a look at the musical wasteland that was Stalin's Soviet Russia, and how censorship affected the composers and musicians during this time. Before we start the story, though, Adam and I just want to thank you for your support as we try and tell these true stories about music. We love learning alongside our listeners as we seek out new and interesting stories from history past. We hope you are having as much fun listening to these as we are making them all for you. So without further ado, let's get right to the good stuff. The Soviet Union had a dark history of using music to manipulate the people of Russia. Following the October Revolution of 1917, Vladimir Lenin imposed free music education in the school system. Sounds great, right? It was all fun and games, other than the fact that the Soviet Union effectively brainwashed a generation of Russians with devious music education. The next head of Russia, Joseph Stalin, started forcing the students to sing songs in a corporate fashion about how kind, loving, and compassionate he was as a ruler. Things got weird very quickly. Control of music went entirely over to the state with the Resolution of 1932. Basically, the government only allowed music that conformed to socialist realism, which was a movement in the arts that glorified the struggle of the lower class and strove for freedom and release from bondage. Ironic, isn't it? Music was henceforth to be simple and direct. It was to espouse the virtues of the Soviet lifestyle. Complicated, elusive, or very dissonant music was referred to as formalistic, and it was illegal. Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and many others struggled with this throughout their lives. It was into this cultural climate that Shostakovich burst onto the scene. He was witty, he was absolutely unique, and he was absurdly talented. He was also forward-thinking. That was a bad mix for a Soviet composer. Earlier, we left you hanging at the end of Shostakovich's Moscow performance of Lady Macbeth. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union himself, had attended and left early. That was never a good sign. Shostakovich was left to torturous worrying that night and all the next day. Why had Stalin left? Clearly this was a bad sign. What did it mean? He didn't have to wait long for an answer. 2 days later, on January 28, 1936, he received a copy of Pravda, the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The headline read, "Muddle," instead of music. In horror, he continued to read.
Several theaters have presented to the culturally maturing Soviet public Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth as a novelty, as an accomplishment. Fawning musical criticism extols the opera to the heavens, trumpeting its fame. Instead of practical and serious criticism that could assist him in his future work, the young composer hears only enthusiastic compliments. From the very first moment of the opera, the listener is flabbergasted by the deliberately dissonant, muddled stream of sounds. Snatches of melody, embryos of a musical phrase, drown, struggle free, and disappear again in the din, the impossible. At the same time as our critic, including musical critics, swear by the name of socialist realism, in Shostakovich's work the stage presents us with the coarsest naturalism.
This unsigned editorial, which historians have suggested was anonymously written by Joseph Stalin himself, came as a shock to the young Soviet composer. He had never been accused of anti-Soviet formalism before. In fact, he had been uplifted as a great example of Soviet ideals. Even his opera Lady Macbeth had been lifted up as an epitome of socialist realism in the past. Judging by the following quote from Dmitri in 1935, just a year earlier, it's easy to see why he was confused.
At one time, I was subjected to fierce critical attacks, principally for formalism. I did not recognize such reproaches to the slightest extent. I have never been and never will be a formalist. To disparage any work whatsoever as formalist on the grounds that the language of the work is complicated and sometimes not immediately understandable is unacceptable foolishness.
Unfortunately for Shostakovich, he had also been documented at composers' conferences discussing the merits of Western music and that of jazz, Schoenberg, and especially Alban Berg. No doubt those words came back to haunt him. Furthermore, Joseph Stalin had recently attended an opera by Dzerzhinsky, a Shostakovich protege, entitled "And Quiet Flows the Dawn." Stalin saw propagandic value in this opera and publicized it as a good example of Soviet ideals. He even awarded Dzerzhinsky the Stalin Prize. Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth, which was much less accessible to listeners, clearly rubbed Stalin the wrong way. The dictator only permitted works that could be readily grasped. If an attendee could leave whistling the melodies easily, it was a success. If not, well, see what happened to Shostakovich? Around this time, the All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs, which then became the USSR Ministry of Culture, was formed. It oversaw, or rather dictated, all the arts in Soviet Russia, not just music. Only a few days after the first damning editorial appeared in Pravda, a second hit the press. It viciously attacked Shostakovich's ballet score for another work playing in Moscow entitled The Limpid Stream, in part because it didn't draw heavily from the Russian folk song repertoire. The editorial ran under the headline, "Balletic Falsity," and it was just as ridiculous as Muddle instead of music. Here's an excerpt.
The authors of the ballet, both producers and composer, evidently reckon that our public is undemanding and that it will swallow everything that nimble and impertinent people cook up for it.
This negative article in a government paper, now the second in as many weeks, ruined Shostakovich. A steady stream of negative editorial began to appear throughout the Soviet Union, prompting Dmitri to ask his friend Isaac Lichman to sign up for a newspaper clipping service. After only 2 weeks of receiving relevant newspaper clippings, Shostakovich's notebook was full. It was 78 pages long. Even Shostakovich's fellow composers began to swallow the government's Kool-Aid about his music. On February 10, 1936, a group of composers met to discuss current events and artistic freedom, and unfortunately for Shostakovich, they didn't side with him. He was now an outcast both socially and artistically, a long fall for the most promising composer in the Soviet Union. Following the fateful Pravda editorial, Shostakovich's friends, acquaintance, and enemies fell into varying categories. Some shunned him for their own safety, others maintained a secret admiration. Still others turned on him publicly. In short, we narrowed Shostakovich's acquaintances into 4 general categories. First, many people were openly critical of the composer. This would include the government, government-sponsored publications, and most of the press. Whether or not the press actually thought Shostakovich was in the wrong, or if they were coerced, is a different matter entirely. Secondly, many of Shostakovich's fellow composers and peers had allowed their views to bow to the Pravda's incessant editorials. They weren't out to attack Shostakovich from the start, but they were weak and allowed the government's sentiment to shape their own. Thirdly, some well-meaning artists continued to support Shostakovich, although they did think his music needed to adopt realism more fully. They labeled him, in a fairly patronizing way, as merely a young and talented composer who needed more time to learn the Soviet way, rather than be publicly humiliated. One such supporter was Maxim Gorky, an influential literary figure who had access to Stalin. He delivered the following message to the Soviet ruler.
Shostakovich is young, an unquestionably talented man, but very self-assured and quite high-strung. The Pravda article hit him just like a brick on the head. The chap is utterly crushed. Muddle? But why? What does this so-called muddle consist of? Critics should give a technical assessment of Shostakovich's music. But what the Pravda article did was to authorize hundreds of talentless people, hacks of all kinds, to persecute Shostakovich. And that is what they are doing. You can't call Pravda's attitude to him solicitous, and he is deserving precisely of a solicitous attitude as the most talented of all contemporary Soviet musicians.
The fourth group was a small handful of actual supporters. Shostakovich's best friend Solertinsky, a longtime critical ally in the Leningrad press, tried to argue with the Pravda's articles, but the government newspapers bullied him endlessly. Composer Vsevolod Meyerhold had also been damaged by Muddle instead of music, and he defended Shostakovich publicly. Thanks largely to Meyerhold's influence, Shostakovich didn't bend to the breaking point under pressure from the Soviet leadership. He refused to renounce Lady Macbeth. And I quote,
Lady Macbeth, for all her enormous flaws, is for me the kind of work that I could never stab in the back. I could be wrong, and it could be that my courage is insufficient, but it seems to me that one needs courage not only to murder one's own things, but also to defend them.
The newly minted chief of the Committee for Artistic Affairs even went so far as to publicly print Shostakovich's so-called plan for rehabilitation. Here are his words.
If up to this point Shostakovich composed in privacy under the influence of such sorry excuses for critics as Solerinsky, then now his work should proceed first and foremost from our country's abundant repertoire of folk song. It would not be a bad idea for Shostakovich to take a page from the book of Rimsky-Korsakov and become acquainted with the rich mine of musical folklore of the peoples of the Soviet Union.
Shostakovich, the once favorite composer in the Soviet Union, was now absent from the press and from Russian theaters and concert halls. In essence, he was one step away from exile. Rather than repenting, though, he turned towards his Fourth Symphony, completing it at the end of April in 1936. So now we come to the part of the show where we read your emails. And guess what, Adam? Nobody has sent us an email. Not a single person.
No. Where's the love?
I know.
I mean, I've been in some pretty low spots in my life. This is probably fifth from the bottom.
I hear you. Seriously, we will take anything. Feedback about the show, things you hate about the show, things you like about the show, hopefully. If you have a question about a story, or even some random questions for Adam and me, we'll take it all. Send us your emails at theguys@backstagepodcast.com.
And, if you just don't like our email address, that's totally fine. You just have to email us at it one time, bite the bullet, and tell us that you hate it. Maybe we'll change it.
Yeah, we just might. Now let's get back to those By the late spring of 1936, Shostakovich found himself in dire financial straits. Commissions weren't rolling in anymore, and no one was interested in performance appearances from the renounced composer. According to historian Laurel Fay, his income had gone from 10,000 to 12,000 rubles a month to 2,000 to 4,000. He had no mother, wife, and daughter in his care. He needed cash. His need was so great that he agreed to write the music for a play about the Spanish Civil War called Salute Spain. It was simple, easy, and stylized per Spanish music guidelines. He took no risks. It was a sad reminder that the great composer, the shining star of Soviet music, was now subjected to writing uncreative, so to speak, practical music for nothing but a paycheck. His Fourth Symphony was now complete, though, and the debut was scheduled with the Leningrad Philharmonic for December 11th, almost a year after the fateful Pravda editorials. The date finally arrived, and he was terrified. As the Leningrad public opened the newspaper on the morning of December 11th, though, they read the following front-page excerpt.
Composer Shostakovich appealed to the Leningrad Philharmonic with the request to withdraw his Fourth Symphony from the performance on the grounds that it is in no way corresponding to his current creative convictions and represents for him a long outdated phase.
Shostakovich had obviously not withdrawn his symphony out of free will. Government officials had attended rehearsals, labeled the music formalistic and un-Soviet, and Shostakovich was likely faced with two choices. He could either remove it himself or have it removed publicly by the government. Rumors started circulating that Shostakovich had canceled the performance because the conductor, Fritz Stiedry, simply was incapable of carrying out such a difficult work. This is almost certainly untrue. Another theory that had more merit was that the orchestra rejected the music because it didn't fit perfectly with the Soviet ideals of realism. It was a difficult work, and not entirely accessible, so the orchestra may have revolted by not playing well in rehearsal. Shostakovich would have been forced to withdraw the symphony under these circumstances. The truth, however, was that Shostakovich's work was once again vetoed by the Soviet government. His magnificent Fourth Symphony would not be performed until 1961. Following the aborted premiere, he remained in obscurity and relative poverty until he and his friend Solartinsky were hired at the Leningrad Conservatory in 1937. By 1936, Soviet paranoia had exploded. Literary figure Maxim Gorky, the man who had once defended Shostakovich, mysteriously died in June of 1936. His assassination was ordered by Stalin. The infamous Trotskyite Zinovieite conspiracy led to death sentence after death sentence, and by spring in 1937, Shostakovich's own brother-in-law was arrested and his sister was exiled to Central Asia. His mother-in-law was also removed to a labor camp. His high-ranking officer friend in Leningrad, Dombrovsky, was purged and his wife was sent to labor camps. Shostakovich lived in constant fear of his life and liberty. It goes without saying that Shostakovich had not presented anything new to the general public for performance in 2 years. His three most original works, Lady Macbeth, The Limpid Stream, and Symphony No. 4, had all threatened his freedom. In May of 1937, another of Shostakovich's friends, a high-ranking military officer named Tukhachevsky, was executed on false accusations of treason. A few months after that, another mutual friend of his and Tukhachevsky's, a theorist named Zyliev, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Under these circumstances, Shostakovich attended the premiere of his Fifth Symphony in Leningrad in November of 1937. Everyone knew that Shostakovich's career, his freedom, and maybe even his life were at stake. One more failure to satisfy the Soviet government's desire for realist music would be the end of Shostakovich. Fortunately, the composer had written the Fifth Symphony in a standard four-movement pattern. It was accessible in style and melody, and in short, it was uncomplicated. He didn't want to take chances, at least openly. The conductor, Ravinsky, was just a regular staff conductor. He was unknown to the world, and apparently he had no idea what he was getting into. Shostakovich refrained from making public statements about his symphony prior to the debut for fear of saying something wrong. There was no room for a misstep this time around. He waited with bated breath as Mervinsky guided the Leningrad Philharmonic through the symphony. He was justifiably terrified, and the symphony was an unprecedented and a rousing success. Shostakovich's famous Largo section brought the audience to tears. By the end of the finale, the entire audience was standing on its feet, moved with unbridled passion. The audience cheered, sobbed, and applauded, and they wouldn't stop. Shostakovich had to make curtain call after curtain call, and the crowd, fully aware of the government's witch hunt against the composer, began shouting,
"That was his answer, and it was a good one."
After a few minutes of this, it occurred to Shostakovich's friends that he was actually in grave danger yet again, albeit for a different reason. The crowd, so moved by his music, was dangerously close to demonstration status. Given the rate at which Shostakovich's friends were disappearing or being executed, they didn't want the government officials to accuse the composer of causing anti-government insurrection or sentiment. Officials from the Committee for Artistic Affairs were, of course, uncomfortable with the incredible reception. They took the crowd's response as a direct challenge to their judgment, and they attended subsequent performances to investigate. They began planting rumors that the roaring crowds were actually a claque planted in the audience by Shostakovich. If you're unfamiliar with the claque, go look back and listen to episode 1, or check out the article on our site. Popular opinion put a quick end to these rumors, though. For once, Shostakovich came out on top. He played the Soviets' game, and he won. Critics began embracing the symphony cautiously once they realized that it was safe to do so, and they declared that the brash composer was back on the right track to socialist realism. People who knew Shostakovich best saw through the charade, though. They realized that the Symphony No. 5, though a huge success, signaled his compliance with the Soviet artistic demands. His own best friend Solortinsky claimed that it was merely written from the so-called waste matter of the doomed Fourth Symphony. Other leading voices, including the poet Osip Mandelstam, thought that they heard intimidation in the music. They were sad to see the creative vision of a genius altered by an oppressive government. One thing was certain, though. Shostakovich had risen from the ashes of 1936 and placed himself at the very top of Europe's compositional scene once again. And whether or not it was written in accordance with Soviet demands, the Fifth Symphony lives on as one of history's greatest works. Our next episode comes out October the 19th, and that is dangerously close to Halloween.
Yep, I think we'll probably come up with something a little bit creepy for that episode. It actually might not even be quite as creepy as the Tartini Paganini episode brought to you by Satan, but I'm sure we'll come up with something. It kind of depends on our mood, you know?
Yeah, I always know you have something crazy up your sleeve. So listen to us again on October the 19th, and we'll see you then. Backstage this week was lovingly crafted by Adam Gingery.
And it was sonorously narrated by Justin Blackstone. I don't know about you, but we think Viking's really written some awesome background music for us lately. We think you should check out his stuff on our website or on SoundCloud. And if you still haven't seen the artwork from the amazing Vivian Morris from the past couple of episodes, be sure to do so online as well. She also comes up with our comic, and it's on our website and on our Facebook page.
You can find our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher Radio by searching for Backstage Podcast. Once you are there, if you subscribe to the podcast, you'll automatically get the next episode on your phone once it's available. How cool is that? This podcast cannot survive without the support of you, our listeners. If you love what this podcast is doing, please leave a review and a rating for the podcast on iTunes. iTunes uses those reviews and ratings to determine which podcast gets featured. And how cool would it be if more people found out about these awesome stories of music?
You can also go to our website and become a VIP by putting your email address in the box on the right of the screen. VIPs get the weekly comic straight to their inbox, previews of upcoming episodes, and some exclusive commentary from the guys. That's us. It's well worth 2 minutes. At least we think so.
Last, this podcast takes a lot of work from Adam and me, not to mention our collaborative artist and musician. If you want to show your ultimate support, consider becoming a patron of Backstage Podcast. You could tell your friends that you were one of the first patrons of the greatest music history endeavor going on today. That may have been an overstatement, but they won't know that. The more you pledge per month, the more rewards and perks you get from us. Become the patron that helps us take this show to the next level. Find out more at patreon.com/backstagepodcast or click on the Patreon link on the website.
If you haven't been to the website yet, check it out. There are bonus articles, music to listen to, illustrations to see, and comics to laugh at. Find all of the above and more at backstagepodcast.com. You'll be hearing another true story about music in 2 weeks. Thanks for being here with us today on Backstage Podcast.